good evening. There's a lot of new faces here today for me, so nice to meet you. I'm Beth Ann Falstad. I have a nonprofit called the Building Community that I started out in Los Angeles and moved here to Fredonia, Kansas in 2021 during COVID when my husband and I had our son. My husband is Travis Falstad, for those of you in Fredonia. So we came here to raise our son by our family. The mission of my nonprofit is about housing and community development, and so something that's dear to my heart is civic engagement and dialogue. So I think it's an important time to bring people together and cross potential divides and create a stronger community. So that's why I put this event together today. We're pleased to welcome today John Burchill for a presentation of People, Places, and Politics in 1800s Kansas. Our program is brought to us by Humanities Kansas, an independent nonprofit leading a movement of ideas to empower the people of Kansas to strengthen their communities and our democracy. Please take a moment to turn off your cell phones so that we may all enjoy the program. As we begin, let's remember that the information presented, as well as what we share and discuss, is of value and of interest. We will respect one another, even if we have differing points of view. Now that we're in agreement, let's get started. John retired as an associate professor of criminal justice from Kansas Wesleyan University. He is the author of Bullets, Badges, and Bridles, Horse Thieves and the Societies That Pursued Them. He has master's degrees in criminal justice and from Wichita State University, and in rehabilitation counseling from Emporia State University. Please welcome John Burchill.
Thank you very much. This is the second time I've been here to this facility through Humanities Kansas, and I'm glad to be back. So a little bit more about myself, just so you understand. When my wife and I retired from Salina, we moved to Wichita. We have two children. My daughter lives in Wichita with two grandkids, so we needed to get closer to the grandkids. Not too close. We live on the other side of town, but our son lives in Japan. We weren't willing to move there to be closer to him. So he's on his own, although we will visit him later this fall. While I was a professor at Kansas Wesleyan, when I left Salina, I left it as I was also chair of the Human Relations Commission, one of two cities in Kansas that investigated cases of housing discrimination and employment discrimination as an independent body. And then when I moved to Wichita, I've also become a charter member of an organization called Justice Together, which you could look up on Facebook or the internet. And it's dealing with what we perceive as justice issues that need to be addressed by stakeholders in Sedgwick County. And right now we're looking at housing, affordable housing, and the homelessness issue in Wichita. I mentioned these two because my wife and I believe that if you're going to be a member of a community, you have to contribute something to that community. And that means you have to get up and do something. The other way that I can try to contribute is by engaging through Kansas Humanities, and I've done that for quite a number of years with a variety of topics. And so really quick, what are some of the rules of the road for this discussion? If you got a question, a lot of people want you to save it to the end. I don't want you to forget the question. So just holler out and let me know what your question is as we go through. But if you're asking me about something I will cover in a little bit, I might hold you off on an answer until we get to that point. So please do not feel embarrassed about stopping, raising your hand, or just shouting out a question as we go on. So really quick, how did this topic come about, and what are some of the things that we're trying to do? we're trying to look at through Humanities Kansas, or I am, by looking at issues in the past and that have relevance to what's going on today. So, and what can we learn and what can we garner from those? So, politics in Kansas in the 1800s is such a broad topic. When I started looking at that, I said, I have to find a way to narrow it down. Realized we were going to be moving to Wichita, so I looked down to see who were some of the early Shakers, and one of them was Robert Meade, who wrote, this is like my second or third copy, my other ones are worn out, Hunting and Trading on the Great Plains, 1859, 1875. He came here, as a lot of people did, but he came here and he was a Republican at the time, which at the time he came here was the Progressive Party, the Republicans, but he came here and he was actively involved in things like Indian rights, environmental issues, housing issues. I mean, this man was really looking forward. And then if you ever get a chance to read this book at the end, when he realizes he's getting to the end of his life, he takes a tour through Kansas of all the places he lived and worked. And he talks about the things that brought joy to him, but how his heart was saddened by seeing some of the things. And it's not just the physical landscape, but the political one. Also, there's a book, if you have a Kansas, not Fredonia, but a Kansas library card, you can get into a whole bunch of digital or free books. This is a Kansas open book on Kansas populism that I would strongly encourage you. Yes, you can get a hard copy, but being a college professor, I like to write in margins and underline stuff, so I have a hard copy, but you can get this digitally as well. And those were the two primary driving factors, but then I dug into research on all the other topics we'll be talking about. So again, we're looking at what interests Meade, and what did interest him, by the way, was also this the movement of the populism movement. But by looking at his stuff, we're going to set up the context for the whole political movement in Kansas. Context is everything. We need to, so you're going to have to get some of the underlying information first as a setup so that you understand what brought about this big movement and shift in politics in Kansas in the 1800s. So again, we're going to look at history as a guide. James Meade, this is a quote from him. In his later years, he was a president of the Kansas Historical Society, felt that was important. But he said if he was alive today, he would probably say the same thing, that Kansas isn't new and we need to look at the past. Matter of fact, just as a side note, and I hope I do this right, Etz Sonoa, the dig by Ark City, if you're all familiar with what's going on down there. If you don't know, that is the largest archaeological dig in the U.S. and Canada going on right now. And what we are finding is it keeps expanding. They thought, well, maybe 5,000 people, maybe 10,000, maybe 20,000, maybe 30,000. I mean, the city keeps growing. We now know they even had translators in this village to translate languages, not just between the tribes within the what's now the United States, but also to translate for their trade with Aztecs. And so I mean, this was going on. We all know the stories about Coronado visiting our state. So we have that early sort of history of Europeans coming over. And that Kansas, if you don't remember, was part of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. So that the chunk of territory that eventually would become Kansas. There was no political unit called Kansas until 1854. and it was the Kansas Indian Territory. This was to be the permanent reservation for Indians as long as the wind blew and the water flowed. It was no state until 1861. But to give you an idea, so the history, if you want to get my ire up, because I do this when I travel outside the state and someone tells me Kansas is just a flyover state. That's one of the things that really gets me going on. You know from your history that there was a stone found in Wilson County with the date of 1794 carved into it. If you don't, that's one of your locals, but we even have throughout the state much earlier dates, and of course the Indian petroglyphs. In 1887, James Meade, right at the edge of what's now Saline County, found a sandstone head that he said resembled carvings found in Central America. We have our prehistory is still, there's still a lot we're still learning about it and the political structure, but we had cities that were trading across nations and were able to do successful trades pre-Europeans. So I think that's an important part to understand. Now, does everything become great when the Europeans arrive? Well, no, not necessarily. But we're going to start politically with our very first territorial governor, which is Andrew Horatio Reeder. Okay? So as this says, he's appointed by President Franklin Pierce on 1854. It takes him until from July to October to get here. Transportation was a little slow back in those days. Both Pierce and Reeder were known as dough faces. Now, it has nothing to do with their physical appearance. Okay, a dough face was somebody that was from the north but had southern sympathies. Okay? Reeder did not own a slave, but he was sympathetic to the Southern cause. And this was his first political activity at all. He was appointed by the president. When he came, he stopped in Missouri, just across the border, where some people demanded that he give a speech. But traveling through Missouri, he saw the worst of slavery. And the people of Missouri were not happy that he didn't just outright say, I'm pro-slavery. When Reeder said, I am pro letting the people decide. But that didn't make a lot of the Missourians happy. He gave his first Kansas address at Fort Leavenworth. Again, not saying I'm just pro-slavery. I mean, we're looking at his record, we think he was starting to change his mind a little bit on the topic. But when he hits to Topeka, he hits one of the early European settlers of Kansas, Dr. John Stringfellow, who greeted Reeder once he hit the Topeka area, greeted him by punching him in the face, calling him names for not taking a pro-slavery stance. As Reeder fell to the floor, he hit him with a chair, kicked him, and then pulled out his revolver. But two of Stringfellow's friends stopped him from shooting the newly appointed territorial governor. That's how his greeting was started with, which should show you that not much is going to change for this governor's term of office. He was visiting the Stinson family, a pro-slavery family. He was visiting them and talking to them about his stance that people should decide, popular sovereignty, people should decide, I'm really interested in this. When a mob of drunken pro-slavers surrounded the house, they wanted Reeder out there so they can kill him. Mrs. Stinson said, no, we got to give him a chance to rest up, and you guys need to maybe sober up a little bit. Don't go to the smokehouse, which they immediately did, and found extra moonshine. And once they all passed out, just in case they were faking it, she had the governor dress up as a woman and sneak out the back door so that he would make it. So he has to have an election. We have to elect people and get them going and get government. And what does he see? He sees areas that have 200 people cast 1,000 votes. Sees people swarming across the border from Missouri, pro-slavers, and voting. And he realizes this isn't working out. And he sees this, he does some census work, finds out that the election was a sham, and he's worried that maybe we need to move the election and the discussion further away from the border. So he tries doing that to Pawnee. It comes down in the history books known as the bogus legislature, because he said, as he opened it up in July 1855, he said the election wasn't legit. We got to do a redo. And the people that were elected, we could assume illegally, said we're not going to have any of that. And in fact, anybody that wasn't pro-slavery was removed from office. Okay. As a matter of fact, one of the ousted members, John Wakefield, and I apologize, I'm going to look down time to time, make sure I get quotes right. He said in a speech, "Gentlemen, this may be a memorable day, and it may become more so. Your acts will be a means of lighting the watchfires of war in our land." This man saw a civil war coming about 10 years before it actually hit us by the actions that were happening in Kansas. A bill was passed by this bogus legislature transferring everything back further east, close to the border. He vetoed the bill. His veto was overridden, and they adopted later that month the Missouri really harsh slave codes, and then they informed the president that this man is not what we need in Kansas, and he was fired. But when he was fired, he was also under the threat of imminent death again. So Reeder became sort of a master of disguise. He had to get in disguise to flee the state of Kansas and get out alive. Before he left, he knew an attorney that was sympathetic with him, and he helped him draft a will. And again, I'm going to read you a part of this. "I, Andrew Reeder, being in danger of being murdered by a set of vile ruffians and outlaws who are outside all restraints of law, order, decency, and all social obligations, and who are below the salvage in all virtues of civilization, and who will probably kill me for opinion's sake, and in furtherance of that scheme for which already a number of lives have been sacrificed, to wit, the making of Kansas a slave state by violence and force of arms, do, in my view of my death, which may happen today or tomorrow, make this last will and testament." That's the opening lines of his will. He snuck out disguised as a woodcutter. He left a changed man. I'm not saying he was totally virtuous, but he was hoping to make a lot of money with everybody else in Kansas, which wasn't going to work either. But he was able to get out, at least at that point in time, without injury to himself, but disguised. And it required people to help get him out of the state. His biggest concern was, if we're going to address the issue of slavery, the people should be informed and have a vote. And it should be the people of the Kansas Territory, not of Missouri. Okay? I mean, so that's where he kind of left it. So we start getting ready to do some more voting. He pushed in a more detailed census so we know how many people lived in counties, and then we started having more elections. But you may know our history, where a whole bunch of people came from the East, Eastern immigration societies, and people that were brought here to homestead, to become residents so that they could vote, most of them coming here to vote it to be a free state. So for these people, a lot of them were involved in open warfare between free staters and the pro-slavers, but they saw every vote as being critical. So in our history, we have 43 naked voters in 1858. I figured that would wake you up. Franklin County Free Staters were determined that they were not going to let the Lecompton Constitution stand with the Missouri harsh slave laws, which allowed for slavery to go. So they decided, for safety's sake, because several of them had already been injured by pro-slavers, to travel as a group to the polling place, which at that time you had one for the county. Okay? And so they had to travel. Travel's a lot more arduous back then. So they traveled to one polling, but there have been weeks of heavy rain, and not all of them could swim. And when they got to the Ottawa Creek, the river was too tall to cross and going too fast. So the one good swimmer tied some ropes and got across. They created sort of a rope thing, but he had to rest because he took off clothed. And water's going to weigh you down. So what are we going to do? We're going to take our clothes off. Some of them tried to put their clothes, like shirts and things, and stick them in their hats and try to wear their hats. You know, as you can imagine, some of those cowboys, I'm not taking my hat off. Some of them lost their hats. Long story short, they showed up to town, most of them without a stitch of clothes, to vote. And they did. And they did. Leaving a German woman who owned a boarding house and where she also fed people, was known not to have a dress code for dinner. And so she went out to them and said, I don't have a dress code. Why don't you come on in? I'll feed you. They didn't have any money. She said, doesn't make a difference. The pro-slavery movement was defeated in that election. This is as far as they were willing to go. Show up to town naked to vote. So which needs to make you wonder today, what is the turnout that we have for elections? How important is voting to people today in Kansas? Because in the 1800s, they would show up naked. All right? I mean, just to keep that in mind. And I'm watching, just to let you know a little bit about Meade, and his father was a Presbyterian minister, and eventually worked his way out to the frontier town of Des Moines, Iowa. Hard to think of that as a frontier town, but at the time it was, and he was trying to get he said education's important. So he started going to school, but the problem was to get into college, you had to have Latin and Greek at that point in time. And he said that's not going to happen. So he started reading everything he can get his hands on and started listening to lectures every time someone was in town. And somebody showed up who became famous for his association with Kansas, Jim Lane. Have you all heard that name before in Kansas history? Jim Lane was born in Indiana, raised in Indiana, went to the Mexican War, was a Democrat, served as lieutenant governor in Indiana, then went to Congress and voted for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. and saw that this was an important issue for the nation, and then came to Kansas. And then he'd go out and give talks about why this is so important. And it was one of these talks that got me to say, things are happening in this state. So there's an opportunity for business people, but there's also an opportunity to really change the political landscape. What happened with James Meade is he had several trading posts. One of them was in Saline County, or what would become Saline County. It didn't have county boundaries. It was well outside the fort that was Salina at the time. And he had no problems with the Pawnee Indians that would travel through. People were aghast. Why haven't the Indians attacked you and your posts? His response was, because I treat them fair. They're people. You know, I give them the same deal I give everybody else. And they treat me fair. I mean, it wasn't. So anyways, they were going to, the residents of Salina were going to Topeka to make a vote for the county. And what we saw happen in 1862 was Confederates raided Salina. They asked Meade to, nothing's going to happen. We want you to be a sheriff, even though we don't have a county. You don't have to worry. Nothing's going to happen. Confederates raided the city. But he didn't back down. It stood up against them, saved a lot of lives. But then he started paying, this event as an unofficial sheriff sparked his interest in politics. And so he started watching, and I found out that he wrote about one politician that got his interest was Samuel Newt Wood. And I'm going to give you an example. I know this is an oxymoron, but he was a fighting Quaker. He was a Quaker from Ohio, met his wife while he was working in an underground railroad station. Moved to the Kansas territory to help with the cause, was a delegate to the Topeka Constitutional Convention, was elected to the territorial legislature. 1861, he enlists as a private in the Kansas Rangers. I'm going to do this quick. October, he was elected as a captain. In 62, he's appointed as a major in the Missouri Cavalry Federal Forces. And that's January. February, he's a lieutenant colonel. So the man's rising through the ranks, okay? When you read the books about him, the old history books, they talk about he left the military and then came to Kansas and got involved in politics. Why would a lieutenant colonel so early on leave the military? Well, because he was arrested. He was arrested for running a large black market operation, contraband. He was basically stealing from the United States or Union Army, stealing blind. Had 54 men working for him in Union uniforms, but weren't soldiers. They were his band of thieves stealing everything. They would take horses and mules and sell them in other places. Upon his arrest, all 54 men quickly disappeared with all the government property, and the war's breaking out. They really don't have time for a court-martial, and they don't want to chase down the bad guys to get the evidence, so they said, basically, leave. And he came to Kansas, back to Kansas, and gets elected to the state legislature, gets appointed as the state adjutant general, gets elected Speaker of the House in Kansas, running on his war record. I was a lieutenant colonel. But then he resigned in 1869 to operate a Texas cattle ranch. The problem with the cattle ranch was it was based out of a abandoned military post called Camp Colorado. And it was headquarters of a rustling operation that had, are you ready for this, 54 men working there. I wonder where they came from. And matter of fact, when they started growing a little too big, they merged with a family of rustlers called the Slaughters in Texas. Then they started coming after Wood again for this, and he left and ran back to Kansas, where he tried to help form a town in Stevens County using underhand tricks and threats. And what happened is he was trying to create a town that would be the county seat. They realized he was doing a lot of nefarious stuff. They subpoenaed him. As he showed up for court, he was shot and killed. Okay? Now, why do I mention him? Because I didn't see a connection to Wilson County. So I wanted to make sure I didn't pick someone that was but this story was not atypical. We saw a lot of this stuff happening before and after the war. People that would go out, a lot of the Jayhawkers during the war were in it to get their own money, and later, when the war's over, became politicians. And pushing their war records. Really quick, Meade moves around a lot. But every time he moves around, he sees that it's important to bring government to the frontiers of Kansas. He said the easiest way to start is with a post office, and then you need to form a government to get going. So he was really pushing formal government issues. And I'm going to mention this really quick, too. This is the Kansas territory map of the permanent Indian reservations. Okay, now this is how it was originally, okay, and what happened, to understand Kansas and the U.S. a little bit, we're going to go way back really quick. I'm going to take a side trip here. May 14th, 1493, I mentioned this because we're all thinking about Vatican City and what's going on with the Catholic Church right now with the death of Pope Francis. But in May 14th, 1493, it was Pope Alexander VI who issued something called the Papal Bull, or it's basically like a judgment of a court, in which he said that anytime you're out there exploring new lands, if you find new lands and the people are not Christian, you could take the land. Okay, if they're Christian, you got to let them have it, but if they're not, it's yours. That fell over into the United States. John Marshall, Supreme Court, 1823, the Discovery Doctrine. He wrote an opinion that, if you have a chance to read about the Discovery Doctrine, he basically says that Native Americans just don't have the intellectual capacity to even consider letting them own land. Okay, so what happened then is we started like this, we moved to this, forcing all the tribes from the east into the Kansas territory, and now it's getting really crowded with a whole bunch of tribes, many of which had historically been at war with each other. And while this is the Kansas Indian Territory, what happens? Some people in Missouri say, but that's pretty good farmland. The federal government says white people can't move there, and they said, well, we'll just ignore what the courts say and do it anyways. And they started squatting in the line, and so much land ended up being taken over by these squatters that the federal government threw their hands up and said, forget it. So really quick, anybody recognize this cabin? No. Doctor lived in this cabin, and he did something really important for us. He wrote our state song, Home on the Range, from this cabin. Meade heard about it, and Meade said, I know what the Home on the Range is. This is the home on the range. And we start seeing some people look at Kansas. Meade starts writing and making speeches. Side note, he was also one of the founders of Wichita. For those that don't know it, the debate was, are we going to name that city Beecher or Hamilton? Meade and one of his buddies said, you can go to the Arkansas River and see the last of the Wichita tribe. The ways, I'm paraphrasing, the ways we screwed them over, the least we could do is name the city after the people that the land originally belonged to. Which leads us to this poem, and now we got sort of the context built up to this poem. I'll give you a chance to read it. Can everybody see that? They're killing each other over elections and debates. They're ignoring court orders. They're stealing land. What in the world is going on in Kansas? Well, one of the other things that made him wonder what was going on, women. The first woman elected mayor in the United States happened here in Kansas. Argonia, Kansas. In 1886, 14 women held county offices. Some of them in counties where women were not allowed to vote. 1887, the Kansas Bar Association admitted its first female attorney. Salina in 1891 elected their second woman to the school board, the second African American woman to the school board. This woman up here, St. John's, she and her husband moved to Kansas to push the suffrage movement. They saw, as well as the slavery issue, we got to deal with the suffrage movement. And then in the middle, of course, we have Mary Elizabeth Lease. Now, if you want to understand, there's a whole book written about her. Some of the research is a little funky, but still there's a lot of good stuff in there. It's called Queen of the Populists that you could find out there. Somebody defined a firebrand as a person who's passionate about a particular cause, typically inciting change and taking radical action. And that was her. She was the one, if you Google this, to find out who did this, go to the great oracle Google, and want to find out, she is the one that coined the phrase, you farmers need to raise less corn and more hell. That was her. Now, context being everything, please keep in mind that her father, Lease is her married name, her father was what they called a squireen. He was an Irishman that owned his own land, but he was an Irishman, not an Englishman. Small farm. Okay? You got to remember, since the time of Queen Elizabeth I, there was an intentional pogrom, which means a systematic annihilation of a race going on in Ireland. They wanted to get rid of all the native Irish. Okay? And so all the people, the 99% of the people that owned land, when the English came in and invaded, they no longer owned the land. They renamed all the mountains, all the rivers, all the lakes that had had Irish names for thousands of years. Made it a crime to speak Guelga, which or you might know as Irish Gaelic, became a crime. The bards that would tell the stories were harpists, usually blind, so they'd have an occupation. And they would tell the stories. Matter of fact, the harp is the national symbol of Ireland. Queen Elizabeth I found out that they wouldn't quit protest songs, so she ordered all harpists to have their hands cut off. Okay? And then you know about the potato famine. but you may not know the truth of the potato famine. During the height of the potato famine, Ireland was exporting food. They raised a bunch of different crops. Only 20% of the potatoes being raised were damaged. That was the only food the natives were left to eat, was the disease-rotted potatoes. All the other grains, everything else they were exporting to England and other places, they were not allowed to have. The Quakers, sensing that we cannot let these people starve to death, we got to do something. So we have the Choctaw, which were forced from the east, then stopped in Kansas for about a year and a half, and then finally pushed into Oklahoma. The Choctaw at that Trail of Tears knew what it meant to starve to death. The Choctaw gave their annual allotment to the Irish people because we know what it means to starve to death. So this picture here, and I know it's a little difficult to see, I took this, I had to go down and find this in a park in Cork, Ireland. It is supposed to represent an Indian headdress in the shape of a bowl, because the Choctaw gave all their annual money so the Irish wouldn't starve to death. Problem was the British seized the money. The Quakers sent a ship filled with grain, and the British seized it at the Dublin port and said they're not to get one piece of that unless they could pony up hard cash. Lease's father said that's the straw that broke the camel's back. He didn't put any of his money into the bank because he was afraid that they were going to lose their land and all the money because he was still a native Irish. He started using his money to buy arms. He says, we need to have a rebellion in Ireland. But somebody in this group ratted him out, so they took what was left of the cash and fled to the United States. Her father was a rebel standing up for a cause as a minority, and this was how Mary grew up. This is the context that she grew up in. And then by the time they make it down into Kansas, what are they seeing? Farmers that are land rich, money poor, barely able to hold things together, and coming under the thumb of monopolies, people that want corporate farming, all sorts of stuff, and she started becoming the passionate speaker. William Allen White didn't agree with her, but he said she could get up and recite the multiplication tables and have people cheering. One of her speeches when she was saying that about we need to change things, and at one point a farmer stood up, pulled back his coat, showing two sidearms, pistols, saying, what do you want me to do? I mean, she was commanding this, but she was saying, again, one more time, we need to raise less corn and more hell. Okay, and she aligned herself to a couple of the early flash pan political organizations in Kansas that flashed and died, but then eventually to the Populist program. But why was she effective? What was going on at this time? Because at this time she was doing this, it was called the Gilded Age in the United States. And for Kansas, I'm going to let you read this too. I know it's horrible to read things to you. I'll give you a second to read that. It was called the Gilded Age by many. A lot of the wealthy referred to it as the Great Barbecue. What was happening in the Gilded Age? They started preaching something called the gospel of wealth, that money equals morality. Money equals morality. You aren't anything unless you got money. Only the rich. A guy wrote a book called The Origin of Species, Darwin. Herbert Spencer took that and started talking about social Darwinism. And he started saying that the fit had to be left to oversee the unfit. Who are the fit people? People with money. So if you didn't have cash, you weren't fit to govern. Only the wealthy should govern. This was the gospel of wealth. And if you're so intelligent, why aren't you rich? I mean, these are the kind of the comments that are going on. Farmers were pushed to buy more land, buy machinery, go into debt. And once they got them in big enough debt, then they started saying, pay up. Oh, you can't. All right, we're going to take your land. Corporate farming started in Kansas. And this is the stuff that Mary Elizabeth Lease was standing up pointing out to people saying, this is wrong. This is not what we're talking about. So when I say like the Patrons of Husbandry was a political group, later became known as the Grange, might have heard of that. Agrarian led to an independent deal. What happened in 1872, though, because of her, is reform-minded Republicans joined with Democrats to form the Liberal Republican Party. But they both got attacked by both sides. They got attacked by the Democrats and by the Republicans. It quickly died. So we start seeing basically a fertile ground for a new political party. Then comes one of the most influential Republicans in the state, is Mr. Murdoch, who not only was an influential Republican in the state, he was the owner and editor of the Wichita Eagle. Okay. He said, we can't have true politics occurring in Kansas if one party dominates either House or the Senate. We can't have an open debate if it's dominated by one group. And this is a Republican saying, we got too many damn Republicans in Topeka. Amen. Okay? We can't have those debates. And it's the debate and the exchange of ideas that would make politics used to be a good word, according to Murdoch. Because if you got opposing sides can come together and reach a common solution, then that's usually a good solution. And Murdoch's saying, when is that happening? It's not. It's gone in our state. And so, I should go back. What happened then is while he's doing this, you also had the Chicago Haymarket Square riots. People were start saying anybody that goes against Republicans is a communist. But this is what caused the birth of the People's Party. And you see this almost spontaneously happening in Kansas, Nebraska. The old Kansas-Nebraska Act people are acting. And they're forming a populist party. Really quick, what's the populist party's platform? This is going to be a little difficult to understand. But because it led to a legislative war. The Populists said, we want a national currency. There was a national currency, but also any banks could issue their own script. So you could have, and I apologize, I'm just making this up. I'm not saying, just for argument's sake, somebody opens up the Bank of Fredonia, and they start issuing script that can be exchanged and bought and used, as long as the Bank of Fredonia, you could go anywhere in Kansas and use that script as long as the Bank of Fredonia is open. If they go bankrupt, you're out. So they want a national currency. They want ready for this, a graduated income tax. The more money you make, the more income tax you should pay. They wanted postal savings banks because if it was a postal savings bank, it would be protected by the government. Something that we now know through insurance things. They wanted a nationalization of transportation. They were getting hosed by the trains. I'll talk about trains in a little bit, but really quick. The railroads saw so much money to be made in Kansas. They paid off some legislators who immediately declared all the rivers in Kansas to be non-navigable. Therefore, you could not use any more barges on the rivers. Everything had to be done by train or wagon. So I mean, that's what's going on. They wanted what they called Australian ballots. Why would we go to Australia? What was happening in Kansas at the time is you walked into a polling place, everybody saw who you were voting for. For each office, they knew who you voted for. They were saying, we should have a secret ballot. Everybody in the room should not know who we're voting for. Okay? Then the right of the people to elect who's going to represent them in Washington, D.C. Senators and congressmen were elected by state legislators. The Populists said, no, the people should do that. You ready for this? They also said that public salaries of public officials should be commensurate to the price of labor, and they should not get any extra benefits. And they said that if you want people to eat, we need to talk about farm subsidies, but there does need to be tagged with subsidies discussions about water rights and water usage and environmental impact of farming. They also recognize if we don't address those issues, then farms are going to disappear by themselves. So what happened with this? This grew so quick that at the time the Kansas Republicans said not to worry. When it comes time for election, the Democrats will lose votes. So what? They swept the election. They swept the election. They even elected a populist governor, our 11th governor, Governor Llewellyn. So what was the response of the Republicans? The election was stolen. The election was stolen, and what was the response when they said the election was stolen? What did they do? They stormed the Capitol with guns. I know this is, history never repeats itself. They stormed the Capitol with guns. They both sides threatening to use force. This cannot happen. The election was stolen. They came to a truce, sort of. The mornings, the Republicans could be in the Capitol. The afternoons, the Populists. But on February 14th, after the election, the Populists finally refused to leave. They locked themselves in, and the Republicans broke the door down, took over the Capitol. What they didn't realize at the time, as a side note, the janitor of the Capitol at that time was a populist, so he turned off the heat. Later that month, late in February, the fairly newly elected Kansas Supreme Court, by the majority Republicans, decided to side with the Republicans that, all right, we're going to let them stay in office, not the Populists, but the governor has to stay. That was their deal. So what happened was that the people traveled the state in numbers to hold elected people accountable, and they wouldn't do it. And so the people realizing we don't have the money, but we got the people. And they started showing up, and then they started organizing, And they got like-minded people. Again, remember, we have a history in Kansas of some Republicans saying, yes, reform's needed. And in fact, when Murdoch's rebellion was happening, I love this. They referred to that time of Kansas as the Pentecost of politics. Because the tongue of flames was happening as people talked and debated politics in Kansas. And they started going over all the political crimes going on in Kansas. Pomeroy, Caldwell, the two senators. Pomeroy was found not guilty by the U.S. Senate, but barely. And you read the stuff, seems pretty well. But Caldwell, who the city's named after, not only bought the election and paid off people to vote for him in the Kansas legislature, he also paid people to drop out of the race when he was running for U.S. Senator. And the U.S. Senate said, nope, you're a liar and a cheat, you're gone. So what happened was Mark Twain looked at those two people, and he wrote a book, changed the names, about crazy politicians. Okay? And our heroine, Mary Elizabeth Lease, a man heard secondhand about her and then started asking for copies of her speeches. It was so enthralled that Mr. Frank Baum wrote a book called The Wizard of Oz and based Dorothy on her. A Kansas firebrand who took the people together to fight this.
Which politician was the Wicked Witch?
I don't know. The railroads, really quick. 1860, we saw the first locomotives going on. The corruption in railroads in Kansas was so rough. What I could tell you is that we had in 1878, we were already abandoning track in Kansas. We had overbuilt railroads, taking all this land, scooping it all up, people making fortunes out of this. Not all railroads were dishonest, but the railroads, to make even more money, hired a man by the name of Schmidt from Europe because when they take the huge swaths of land, decide where the track's going, we now need to sell the rest of the land once we left kind of just moving west, and we couldn't get people to move in there. So Schmidt said, I hired him saying, we want you to help us sell this land, bring people from Europe. Schmidt was the man working for the railroad, as a side note, that said, there's a group of people I've been watching that are being persecuted in Russia. Mennonites. And they got some wheat that apparently you could plant in the fall, and it might just work in Kansas. Schmidt brought the Mennonites to Kansas and a lot of other religious groups and started planning this. But I'm going to stop with this picture for a second. When you look at when it was just Indians here, they left the snakes alone. Snakes kind of had a sacred history in the oral traditions of a lot of Native American cultures. So they left snakes alone, including rattlesnakes. And they used buffalo, but what happened when the Europeans came into Kansas? We killed all the buffalo. So that the wolves, guess we had a wolf population, used to cull the buffalo herds by going after the old buffalo. When the old buffalo were gone, wolves, contrary to coyotes, were known to take people off the saddle and attack them for food. So they had wolf hunts. At the same time, you had rattlesnake hunts, because rattlesnakes were everywhere in the state. And I found it interesting because there was a debate going on that people in your county in the newspapers were saying if you got bit by a rattlesnake, whiskey was the antidote. So Wilson County was publishing the paper, you get bit by a rattlesnake, copious amounts of whiskey. Yeah, well, don't worry. You have some neighboring counties that were even crazier that said, no, you need to put a moonstone on it. A moonstone, yes. Greenwood County said you need to take a shotgun shell and pour the gunpowder on the wound and then light the gunpowder. The point was that in the 1800s in Kansas, there were so many ways there were horrible ways you could die in Kansas. Horrible, horrible ways. But the worst, the absolutely most heinous form of death that you could imagine would be to be talked to death. And I've now just hit my 1 hour time limit. So what I'm going to do is leave it up for some questions, but let me start by asking you one. Do you think we're still hearing the gospel of wealth being preached today?
Exactly what's going on today. Elon Musk is proof of that.
Do you think there'd be a benefit for having a balanced legislature? I mean, and again, these are all things that have happened and debated in Kansas. What do you think the public opinion of a moderate Republican, a Democrat is today? Because what happened after this legislative war is the extreme sides came together. And then Kansas had a reputation for being moderate. If you were a Democrat, you were a moderate Democrat. If you're a Republican, you were a moderate Republican. But what happened is, as we start seeing, is that it was kind of like the two sides came together, and a lot of people are saying they're now, about where we had the legislative war. It took that legislative war, I think, to wake people up and say we need to start reforming how we do business. People have been talking about Mary Elizabeth Lease and others, Murdoch, have been talking about it, and there were movements of people like-minded on both parties saying we need to come together. And they were attacked by their own parties. Okay, so if you think that, again, that's something that's going on, should farm subsidies come with some sort of environmental requirements? I'm guessing now, but I'm getting concerned about water. I think in my lifetime that's going to be a huge, huge topic. And I just have one more question to ask you is, what's the voter turnout today?
Not very good.
And in Kansas, we had people showing up naked to vote. Because it was important, that important for them. I mean, this is the history of Kansas. I hate to do this, but Winston Churchill, I'll finish with a Winston Churchill quote, is he said that occasionally man will stumble upon the truth and will pick himself back up and keep on going. We've seen this, and I could tell you that when we saw people storming the U.S. Capitol, and I was towards the end of my career as a professor, and I'm standing there with other professors saying, and the other professors are saying, I can't believe this happened. How could this ever happen? And my comment to them was, well, it happened in Kansas. And I said, I could tell you, it can go one of two ways. It could bring people together if you have the right movement afterwards, or it's going to pull people apart. It's going to pull people apart. NPR radio, driving out here, I listened to NPR radio, and it was very prophetic. They had a interview with someone talking about what does it take to bring protests and make them viable again. What does it take to bring about political change? So if you get onto NPR, the evening show, and you should listen to that interview again, but I want to tell you that you could make change politically with money or with people. That's how the power is defined typically in our country today in politics, is by money or by people. And if you don't have a lot of money, then you'd need to have a lot of people. I mean, that's kind of how the power differential there. Any questions? Because if you don't have any right off the bat, I'm going to hang around for a little bit because I saw brownies back there. And I'll be glad to visit with any of you one-on-one.
Do you believe Lincoln would be a Republican now or a Democrat?
Historically, I think he would probably be, in my opinion, a Democrat or maybe even a libertarian. I'm not. But yeah, most people don't follow the political platforms. So if you ask most people, what is the platform of your political party, most of them adopt the politics of their parents, but don't understand what's involved with that. You know, and that's part of the education that I think needs to happen. So there were a lot of, again, there were dyed-in-the-wool Republicans that were the progressive party that came to Kansas to fight slavery and progressive movements. And it's kind of like they fought to get each other up to the top of the mountain. When they got to the top of the mountain, they said, we kind of like it up here. Better not let too many people up here. You know, things started to change a little bit. And the Democrats were back then would be much more what we consider today conservative and radical as the far right. And so our understanding of right and left has pretty much flip-flopped through the time. But what still happens is, in Kansas's history, is that people have made a difference. In the 30s, we had a person running for senator who said, we all need to pay attention to this guy called Hitler. He has some great ideas out there, and we got to get rid of the Jews. And he had the support of the Klan. You had 4 pastors leave their church and traveled across the state saying why we can't elect this person to represent Kansans. And they brought crowds to every community they went to. It was tough on them because some of them weren't welcome back to their congregations. But they made a difference. They brought enough crowds and enough people to educate them about what this man really was to stop him from getting elected. So, I mean, again, we have history that tells us a lot about what we can do in Kansas. Just when we stumble across it, we need to stop, look at it, and say, what have we learned and how could we use that? Not get back up and keep on going. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
So, John, the Populist Party,
Yes, sir.
where did that settle in?
I'm sorry?
Where did that settle in between the Democrat and the Republican?
Well, it started originally with the vestiges of that moderate, that liberal Republican party that was Republicans and Democrats that came together. It didn't work, but then that same core helped there. What's really interesting, and this county was one of the heavy populist counties. I got to tell you, when you could tell a Kansas populist county when you look at the county records or the history books. If they mentioned women by name, it was a populist party. I told you that about the second African American woman elected to the school board in Salina. That's all they could find out on it. They would never mention names. And if they ever mentioned the name of a woman in Saline County in the 1800s, it was Mrs. No first name, nothing else. But you can go around here in Wilson County, Neosho, you look at some of the people from there, and they give the full names and the history of the women because it was people. People were more important than property. And so when you look at that history, I find that fascinating. So some books are you just read all these about these women, and then you dig further and you find a heavy populist history in that county. So I think that's one of the tricks there as well.
Do you think that from the Union Army coming to Kansas is a reason that the state of Kansas is so Republican now? Is it, like you said, that
No, the majority of the Eastern immigration societies and the people that sent people to Kansas to homestead to vote for it to be a free state were Republicans.
yes,
From the East. And that's what brought the Republican Party to Kansas, and they were going to do it honestly. By the way, they were getting murdered, I mean literally, not figuratively, murdered in their homesteads, to the point where they started writing back to their societies that sent them saying, we're being massacred. This is before the Civil War. We don't have anything to defend ourselves. We're sorry, but holding up the Bible isn't good enough. It doesn't stop the bullets. That's when Henry Ward Beecher, the most famous preacher, started sending his Bibles, which are really Sharp's rifles, to Kansas, marked as Beecher's Bible. Henry Ward Beecher was so popular as a preacher at the time. During the Civil War, he was making $100,000 a year.
wow,
When the end of the Civil War ended and they were going to rededicate Fort Sumter, where a lot of people believe it started, they said, Lincoln, we want you to give the address at Fort Sumter for the rededication. Lincoln said, you need a better speaker than me. You need to get a hold of Henry Ward Beecher. And he did. Lincoln should have done it because that weekend he went to a theater instead.
That's just history.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, yes.
I see a danger in what's happening with our public school system and the control of curriculum in the country, and how that will further degrade our civic engagement and critical thinking skills and ability to fight back and to understand things in a larger picture. And I'm curious, from your perspective, what can be done to combat that?
Any of the sources I'm going to give you right now would be branded as being liberal hogwash. But two things. I would strongly recommend the book Prequel by Rachel Maddow, if you haven't read that, about the rise of fascism before World War II in the United States and leading up to the Red Scare following it and how that happened. And the movie Good Night, Good Luck, with George Clooney in it, about Henry Murrow. And it's all about how to deal with it. I'm a retired college professor. My best days in the classroom were when kids would stop and say, wait a minute, you're trying to get us to think. And I'm going, yes, yeah, exactly. That's what I want you to do. Just as a side note, I had some students come to me and say, they enjoyed my classes. Would you be the sponsor in Kansas Wesleyan for the young Republicans on campus? I said, they had to have a faculty sponsor. I said, sure. The president wanted to do an internship with the lieutenant governor. Could you write me a letter of recommendation? I did. I thought it was a beautiful letter. He calls me from Topeka, angry. And Professor Burchill, how could you? I go, how could I what? He said, your letter of recommendation. I said, what was wrong with it? He said, they checked, you're registered as a Democrat. How could you be the faculty sponsor? And I said, you asked. And I said, from the classroom, did you have any idea what No, we thought maybe you're more. I said, I'm trying to give you both sides in the classroom. It's important that you hear both sides equally, but you need to think. You need to reason out where you stand. And I said, I'm glad you couldn't tell I was a Democrat, but I said, the point is you got to learn to think. And college is too late to have that start. So I'm sorry, and I'm glad I'm the age I am, because I don't have to deal with, as a college professor, all this artificial intelligence stuff, or dealing with the results of the COVID remote learning, coming up to college. Both of those would probably scare me. I think when you look at the movements, you got almost all of them start small. And I think if you're looking at elected positions, that's where you do. I mean, you need to make sure, whatever your party is, every precinct has a chairperson. First of all, which, I mean, and I know a lot of communities that don't, but you need to make sure every precinct, Republican, Democrat, whatever your party affiliation is, need to have a precinct chair. But then you also need to start bringing people in for local elections. Again, school board, things like that, city commission, county commission. You start there, and then if you have the right people, Republican or Democrat, talking about both sides of an issue and willing to talk across the aisle and have a debate to figure out what's the best for the community, that's when you see politics become a good word again. Right now, politics, and it's political. It's kind of like you're saying that with like you're spitting out the side of your mouth. Well, that's political. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
See, I could either get in trouble. This is only the second time it's come up what my political affiliation is, but it's important, I think, that you look at that. And I should add, because I said context is everything. I came from my parents were opposite sides. My mother was Scottish and Republican. My father was a blue-collar worker from Chicago, and Irish, So, I mean, it was everything, ethnically. My mother said the difference between Scottish and the Irish is Scottish pray on their knees, the Irish pray on the Scottish. My mother went to college at Ripon College, which is the birthplace of the Republican Party. Like I said, my father was a blue-collar Chicago. The only time I saw him, I remember my father being sick, other than when he died. He had the horrible flu, and he came downstairs, and my brother and sister and I are looking at him. Never saw him as sick and moving like that. And, what are you doing downstairs, Dad? He says, I have to go vote and cancel your mother's vote. So I could also tell you that when it comes to general elections, I've never voted a straight ticket. So I'm.
Yes, it should be.
Yeah, but I know there's a lot of people that do. So. Okay. Again, I don't want to kill you by talking to you to death. That's not my intent. So I'll hang around and have some more conversation and brownies.
Thank you.
Yes.